Well, how do you feel about these quote unquote conspiracy theories that seem to turn out to be true? Conspiracy theories are the product of what he calls a monological belief system. So, this idea that you have one sort of central idea that maps onto everything else you see. If you convince people that conspiracy theories are true, you're actually going to disempower them.
Jordan Peterson does master classes on how to do this.
Who is the deep state? So my handle is Moral Monster. I am a professor. I teach in a liberal studies program at the University of Memphis. And lately I've been doing research on conspiracy theories. And I thought I had some things that might be helpful given what just happened with Candace Owens and what has happened in the past. I contacted you a couple years ago, maybe a year ago, when you were talking to Lauren Southern a lot about conspiracy theorizing and that kind of stuff. And I thought I might have some things that might be interesting for you to think about. And especially if you're going on a new arc where you're going to be debating conspiracy theorists, maybe I have some strategic ideas that might be helpful.
Sure, go for it. Hit me up. Wait, real quick, can you tell me how old you are? You sound young. You sound like a young man.
Well, that's a great compliment. I am 46, just turned 46.
Oh,
so
Jesus. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm glad I sound young. Let's put it that way. Let me just say, first of all, that, just by way of background, conspiracy theorizing wasn't really an area of interest for me at all. As when I was in graduate school, I mostly write on the philosophy of art. However, in my first teaching assignment, I taught at a school in South Carolina, and I had to develop an honors seminar. And one thing about teaching honors seminars is that you have to develop these courses that are interdisciplinary that people from all majors can take.
Okay.
And so I was trying to develop a theme, think of something that students would like that's, less obscure than philosophy of tragedy or something like this, what I normally work in.
Mm-hmm.
And I was working with a thesis student on a project on conspiracy theory in media. She was a communications student. She went on to work for CBS after she graduated. And I thought, well, I can teach a class on this. And so I started teaching this class in 2012. And along the way, developed a whole research agenda sort of around conspiracy theory, especially as it relates to aesthetics. And we can talk about that in a minute. So this is not my primary research area, although this is something that has become more and more relevant and actually really important for my students.
Okay.
And so currently I'm in, working on a book about this. But I wanted to just sort of, talk to you a little bit about maybe your approach and ask you some questions about how you think about conspiracy theorizing, because obviously, on the fringes of the internet where you have operated, and maybe you're moving away from, but it seems like you still drift back.
Edmund, thanks for the $50.
It seems like this is something that will appear in your orbit a great deal. So whether you're talking to Candace Owens, which is much more prominent, or Lauren Southern, or even Nick, conspiracy theory is something that pops up a lot, and it seems really ubiquitous in online culture anyway.
Okay.
And so I'm wondering about how you think about this. So let me just ask you, just to kind of set up where we are. So when I'm talking with someone and they say, oh, the moon landing was fake, we never landed on the moon. Oftentimes my reply will be, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. And what I mean by that is that that's not an explanation that's worth taking seriously.
Okay.
Basically, what I mean when I label something a conspiracy theory is that it's just false, right? I'm not taking it seriously.
Sure.
So do you think of conspiracy theory as the term, as the label, as just a label for something being false? So conspiracy theory equals not worth my time to consider. Or are you of the mind that, well, just because it's a conspiracy theory, it might be true? So what do you think about that?
I think it's funny. I think there are 3 stages to understanding what conspiracy theory means. I think that the most base understanding of a conspiracy theory is crude and incorrect. I wouldn't say crude, I would say incorrect. And a conspiracy theory is just like a false statement or like a bad thing that isn't real. There's no reason to believe it. So this is that's a conspiracy theory means, yeah, it's like an emotive way of saying, boo, I don't like that idea, or boo, I think that idea is not true. I think that a slightly more sophisticated form of a conspiracy theory is leaning into the actual word conspiracy, saying that there was some sort of plan that was concocted to make a thing appear a certain way. So like the moon landing was a conspiracy theory, means that there was a plan to make it seem real even though it wasn't. And then I think that the I think that the final evolution of, or I shouldn't say final, my current understanding of conspiracy theory is I actually think conspiracy theory fits well, but it's in a way that would have to explain, and that conspiracy theories, in my opinion, they take a collection of facts that could be explained by some pretty obvious Occam's razor explanation, and instead it substitutes a conspiracy or a top-down explanation that happens to also plug into a whole bunch of other titillating or sensationalist narratives that one might have. So like the three stages of this might be like, oh, like if I say the moon landing is a conspiracy in its dumbest form, it's like, oh, it's fake. Or if I say like, oh, well, the moon landing is a conspiracy, I mean like, oh, well, okay, I guess it was planned by some people. Or if I say the moon landing is a conspiracy theory and it's most like, in the highest form that I understand it right now, is it like, the moon landing is fake because there is a whole grand narrative of some top-down power that's orchestrating events around the world that not only explains these things that seem maybe hard to explain, but also explain a whole bunch of other things like all of the ills and everything of society, essentially. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely. So it sounds like you're a little bit more on the, when I label something a conspiracy theory, I just mean I'm not taking it as a serious explanation.
Kind of, although I try not to call things conspiracy theories because I think that would be at the end of a debate when I feel like I've reached the end. Because if I call something a conspiracy theory, that's how most people hear it. Oh, it's fake. If I'm arguing with somebody, so they'll immediately shut down, and then I've lost the ability to communicate anything else. Yeah.
Sure. And so, you know, how do you feel about these quote unquote conspiracy theories that seem to turn out to be true? So, for example, if you were doing a Watergate research before the scandal, exploded, before Nixon had recorded himself, and you had this theory about what was going on at the Watergate Hotel, people would have regarded you as a conspiracy theorist. So, what do you think about those cases where it seems like a conspiracy theory turns out to be true?
Well, I think that you have to be careful. This is why I don't really like the term conspiracy theory as much. If I'm using it as purely as a pejorative and not to further like a reasonable conversation, because like conspiracy in the strictest of senses, conspiracies are true. People make plans and things do happen, right? Like 9/11 was a conspiracy. There was a group of people that got together and planned to do something. Watergate was a conspiracy. Conspiracy theory has such like a negative, pejorative connotation to it that, yeah, you have to be really careful how you use it because in some ways it loses its descriptive power and in other ways it can backfire. So for instance, I think in a pejorative sense, there was a conspiracy theory that COVID was created in a lab in China. I think there was a huge conspiracy theory around that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if more evidence comes out that says that, it was, and there's some stuff that points to the idea that maybe it did originate from a lab. That's still not the consensus, but it's possible, more plausible at least than it was in the beginning. Well, now if you've called that a conspiracy, well, now you look like you're being a hypocrite by saying like, oh, well, actually, maybe there is something here. So yeah, I just think the term conspiracy theory is really bad. It's too pejoratively loaded in either direction.
Good. So when philosophers write about this, and of course philosophers are concerned, and there's not a great deal of philosophical literature devoted specifically to conspiracy theorizing, although it's growing. Philosophers are concerned with whether or not a conspiracy theory ever ought to be taken seriously as a standard of explanation, right? So whether or not we can be a generalist, which is this is the camp of philosophers that say that conspiracy theory, just by design, by the nature of the kind of explanation that it never is going to count as a good explanation. That's the generalist approach versus the.
When you say real
approach.
quick, when the term conspiracy theory is being used there, what does it mean to say conspiracy theory there?
Good. So there's definitely some components to the conspiracy theory. So here's a definition that a philosopher called I think Barbara Fredrickson is her name. She offers. She says a conspiracy theory is a proposed explanation of events that's contrary to an officially sanctioned alternative. So that's the first criteria. It's contrary to the officially sanctioned narrative. So secondly, it involves the causal agency of a group of agents working together in secret. So there's your conspiracy. And thirdly, it's often or most likely for a sinister purpose. So when we say conspiracy theory, this is what philosophers typically are referring to when they're talking about this. So these three components, it's in opposition to the officially sanctioned narrative. It contains a conspiracy, and there's some kind of sinister or malevolent element to that conspiracy, right? So for example, that third component you might wonder about, because who can decide what's sinister or what's malevolent? But it would be really weird for you to have a surprise birthday party for someone
and call
jump
that a
out from behind the couch. And they say, "Oh, you conspired against me." That seems strange, right?
Okay. So, yeah. Okay, that's fair. Okay, gotcha. This is a workable definition. I understand this. Okay.
Right. So Now, the particularist approach, this is the dominant view in philosophers working in this area. Epistemologists working in this area are particularist about conspiracy theories. They say that you can't rule them out just as a category of explanation because there's no criteria within that's universal to all conspiracy theories that automatically make them a bad explanation. And so, in other words, conspiracy theories turn out to be true once in a while, so you just have to look into them all, right?
Correct.
That's the more particularist approach, right? So,
Okay.
so these are the two sort of, the two sort of ends of the extreme. Now, there are variations. I find myself a little bit more on the generalist side of things, but mostly for pragmatic reasons. But most philosophers defend some kind of particularist view. So that's sort of where the philosophical debate stands, and it's certainly interesting, like from an epistemological standpoint, like how can we know what's true, and it's certainly something I spend a lot of time with my students, thinking about, like, can we recognize certain features in an explanation of an event in the world that automatically makes it not a good explanation.
Interesting. I don't like the only thing I don't like about this generalist view of how you said it, the generalists might view a conspiracy theory, is that it feels like this is, would it make sense to say this is like normatively loaded to be a bad thing? That like it's not,
Yes.
it's something that shouldn't be, or it's like epistemically poisoned. And like you said, I don't like that because, like, I don't know if you can say deductively, if I look at these 1, 2, and 3, opposition to official story, conspiracy between people, and sinister element, things like this happen. So I don't think I can be opposed to this as a category of things when these things have clearly happened in the past. So that seems really strange to me that somebody would write something off just based on these 3 elements.
Good. So there's more to it than there's more to the generalist argument against conspiracy
Sorry.
theories
Okay, I
than
want
it's merely baked into this definition.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha.
For example, a lot of times a generalist will point to the fact that conspiracy theories are by design not falsifiable.
True. Okay, yes.
Because if there's a conspiracy, then of course there's going to be a counter information that disconfirms the conspiracy, right? So I can never disconfirm it because evidence against the conspiracy actually counts as evidence for it. Right.
I'm so curious if I can ask you, is there a fallacy called all roads lead to Rome?
I heard you say this the other day on stream, and I haven't seen this in any sort of informal fallacy textbooks or whatever, but that seems right.
Gotcha.
There seems something really fallacious about this reasoning, that there's something going on here, and people that do formal logic probably have a better label for it than I do, but it seems like there's something going on here that's really related to the topic that we're pointing to.
Yeah, somebody told me that it's just what I'm saying is just like basically lack of falsifiability in other words. But the example, if you heard me say this, the example was related to Andrew Tate. Did you hear me walk through that?
Yes.
That every single possible thing, like you said, any form of disconfirming evidence actually proves the theory, which is frustrating. Yeah. Okay.
Right, and which is one reason it's almost, one sort of epistemological reason it's almost impossible to argue with a conspiracy theorist. Put aside the psychological stuff,
Yeah.
because counter evidence counts as evidence for it. Which is crazy. Like no other field of human experience would we say, oh, all this disconfirming evidence of my experiment, for example, proves that my hypothesis in science is true. That's crazy.
Well,
but
in formal study maybe, but in our personal lives, I mean, I'm sure we could think of examples, right?
Sure.
Yeah,
that's right. Well, in relationships, for example.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah. I know he loves me. I know he doesn't love me because of all these things he's doing. Like, oh, of course he doesn't message me. It's because he doesn't want to come off as too strong, or like dumb stuff like that. Yeah. People can mind fuck themselves that way. Yeah. But okay, gotcha.
Right. So that's the interesting sort of philosophical question that goes on in epistemology. But for what I was thinking about when I was thinking about your conversation with Candace and conversations you've had with Nick and Lauren over the years. I'm more interested in what you think, and there's some really insightful things that you said after you talked with Candace yesterday that map onto the psychological literature about conspiracy theory. But I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit about why you find conspiracy theories. Why are people motivated? Why are they attracted to them? What do you think is going on there? Because there are lots of people that just aren't attracted to conspiracy theories on all sides of the ideological spectrum. They just aren't drawn to them. But there are people that really are drawn to them. So what do you think's going on there? What's the motivational story that we can tell about that?
I haven't sat down to like assign weight to these, but like in terms of like different things that are happening. One is going to be, I think it's probably a very human thing that you want like a cohesive view to the world. Like if we can have one theory that explains everything, I like physics, I guess trying to write, right? If we can have one theory that can just explain everything in the world, it's so easy to orient so many parts of your life around that. So like a feminist might be tempted to explain that the reason why airline tickets are so expensive is because women aren't taken into account when it comes to staffing, and that's why blah blah blah. And it's feminism is the reason why, or the patriarchy is the reason why, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one is a cohesive worldview, that if you can have a singular problem or narrative that explains everything, it just helps you make sense of everything, helps you orient your life around it. That's one thing. I think all of my subpoints, I think, are probably going to spawn from there. That if I have a particular belief about the world, that my overarching narrative can also help reinforce that belief. So for instance, if I think that capitalism is evil and then I get fired by my boss, it's very attractive if I can thread capitalism into the reason why I was fired. Not only does it give me some personal comfort and satisfaction because now I can externalize the blame and the agency into this other thing, it also reinforces how evil and horrible capitalism is. I get to identify him as being an element of that, et cetera, et cetera. I think that like a desire for an easy to understand cohesive worldview that like normatively and epistemically reinforces our view of the world, I think is where the origination of a lot of conspiracies come from. Like if I think of like all the major ones, if I think of like mRNA vaccines, I can think that like Donald Trump and the Republicans are all cast as like these evil villains opposite to these horrible people like Fauci, because big pharma and these big companies that are against America and are trying to destroy us are forcing this horrible medicine down our throats. And so I'm going to accept every single conspiracy down there because it reinforces that whole point of view. It might explain bad things like, well, how did my president lose the election? Well, because it was rigged and all these people are working together. Andrew Tate, it's the same shit. Yeah, I think that's, if I had to guess, actually, it's probably going to be that huge thing, that desire for a cohesive worldview.
I think there's a lot to be said toward this, especially in the West. So maybe we could talk about the role that religion has historically in this, a little bit later on. Mm-hmm. But let me just ask, by contrast, just to test this hypothesis, would you say that most people, however, want a coherent worldview? Like most people, right?
Yeah, but I guess it's a bit tautological. I think most people want a coherent worldview, but I think the interesting part is, what does coherent mean? I think that some people, I don't know why, but people seem to be willing to accept varying levels of complexity for how they view the world, whereas other people, well, no, that was it, yeah. People are willing to accept varying levels of complexity for how they view the world. So for instance, like, Epstein's death is a really good example. I don't want to hit on something that we majorly disagree on because we don't have to get into the weeds on it. I don't need to do that. But like, I'll just, from my personal perspective, when I investigated the stuff around Epstein's death, it seemed like Epstein's death was like very easily explainable after reading the full report of federal prisons are in a horrible state of upkeep. These employees were incredibly fucking lazy. All of this seems to be verified by testimony from outside parties, from stuff that was happening before, etc. Like all of these facts together seem to explain pretty convincingly that Epstein's death was most likely a suicide. It seems to be overwhelmingly evident after reading that. But there's a lot of other factors that you have to take into account there. And if we just say that, well, Epstein was obviously murdered by the government, it makes that story and narrative so much easier to understand, and it reinforces all my other views about the world. Why would I take this like highly frictioned path of believing all of these other factoids or all these other factors and facts that I have to keep in mind to make this other thing work, and it doesn't reinforce my worldview and blah blah blah? Like I would just opt for the quote unquote conspiracy theory to explain it, you know?
Good, and there's a lot to be said for this. I guess what I'm still trying to get at is this contrast. Like, I get that there are a lot of people that are more comfortable with ambiguity, mm-hmm. but it does seem that, especially in the West, most of us really want things to fit into neat boxes. But most of us, and this is still like consistent, in the literature, people that count as conspiracy theorists, at least in American culture, really only make up what we might call 30% of like the population. Like, as best we can measure this, who knows, But
what is wait, I'm so curious what we mean when we say that.
So there's a study by a sociologist named Joseph Usinski that was done in 2023. And basically what he does is he analyzes data from news reports. I think they're doing some stuff with online activity and that kind of thing. But again, it's pretty limited. Like, obviously more research needs to be done and how we can even measure this. Mm-hmm. But what he wants to say is that conspiracism, by which he means like the belief in conspiracies as like guiding forces in society, has not significantly changed in the 20th century. Like, there's a hardcore group of people that are really true believers, mm-hmm. but that number hasn't grown or shrunk.
Gotcha. The only reason I asked is because I feel like if I were to list like every single conspiracy theory, I feel like 95% of Americans would believe at least one of them. That's why I was curious what we meant when we said 30% are conspiracy theories, but maybe they're more prone to believe in a majority of them, or a plurality or whatever of them or something. Yeah.
So this is something that tracks with some of the data as well. And you're right. Probably I could find something that counts as a conspiracy theory that people, even people that are really skeptical would say, yeah, I give that more attention than others. But so there's something that's really interesting there. So the psychology conspiracy theory wasn't really, there wasn't really a robust research program in this until 1990s. And it really occurred like sort of in concert with the release of Oliver Stone's film JFK. Psychologists began to be really interested in the attraction of conspiracy theories. And one of the earliest sort of hypotheses about this attraction was produced by a psychologist named Ted Goertzel. And he argues that conspiracy theories are the product of what he calls a monological belief system. So this idea that you have one sort of central idea that maps onto everything else you see. So think, for example,
so like when I was saying like for the feminism thing, yeah, you've got that one thing that is explanatory of every single phenomenon in society, right?
Absolutely. So imagine that you are anti-Semitic, for example. Suddenly when 9/11 comes along, you think, oh, the Jews did it. Or when you find out the moon landing was faked, oh, the Jews did it. You find out JFK was assassinated, because this monological belief system is a nice thing that you can lay over everything that you see in the world.
Yeah.
And Goertzel proves this, and it's been sort of verified over and over again in subsequent studies, that people that are prone to believe in one conspiracy theory usually aren't just believing in one. They usually believe in a whole bunch of them.
For sure. Yes, I agree. This is one of my issue for a long time, like sorting through religious people, is because some people have an incredibly nuanced grip with their religion, and other people have are more prone to the monological belief thing. And for a while, when I was younger and way more anti-theist rather than just an atheist, I would write people off immediately just for being religious, because I'm like, if you're prone to this sort of belief system, depending on how much you believe it, you're probably prone to a whole bunch of other stupid stuff. Yeah.
Well, and this is, absolutely something that applies not just in the conspiracy theory realm. I mean, this applies to politics. Everybody's pointed out that if I can predict your belief on guns, I'm more than likely going to be able to predict your belief on, climate change.
Correct. Yeah.
So these are the product of ideologies, right? So, so that's something. I'm still interested, and my questions are a little loaded because I have somewhere I think I'd like to suggest to you, but I'm still interested in trying to differentiate between because all of us are prone to more simplistic explanations of the world. All of us are prone to preferring intellectual shortcuts. All of us are prone to ideological commitments.
Yeah.
And so
Except for me.
Is it? Well, right. Obviously, you're committed to nothing, as Candace Owens points out. Yeah. She was clear that you don't believe in anything.
True.
So why is it that there are some people that just aren't interested in conspiracy theories, whereas a lot of us, and I don't include myself, but a lot of people are really drawn to conspiracy theories? What's the deal?
I mean, I don't know. I feel like this is one of those questions where if I had the answer, I'd be a multi-billionaire selling courses on how to break people out of brainwashing or whatever.
Sure.
It feels like some people. It feels like critical thinking is a skill that's not taught, or is very rarely taught, to where when I say critical thinking, I'm like explicitly referring to like metacognitive thought processes that people are oftentimes not trained to observe how they observe or think about how they think. And instead, when people hear the term critical thinking, what they usually think of is like common sense or something, like the opposite of critical thinking usually.
Right.
And that I think people have a lack of understanding of how unreliable their own brains are. I think I mentioned a lot that I took a psych course in high school that actually opened my eyes on this a ton, that your brain is a very unreliable narrator, and then people don't understand a lot how complicated everything going on in your brain is. So for instance, we think that when we see a thing that's all that's happening, that our eyes are like a TV screen, and they don't realize that everything you see is actually upside down. They don't realize that you actually have like higher resolution towards the center of your vision, that you've got blind spots on both of your eyes, that you don't see stuff as much in your peripheral, that your brain is doing so much work to construct the world. The reality is truly constructed in the mind. They think that like the eyes are just like these truth-seeing things that deliver 100% reality. And because people don't have an understanding of the limitations of their own cognitive processes, they venture through life with way more confidence in their like immediate observations and their narrativizing than they should. I think that's one big factor. So one is people are overconfident in their own ability to understand things free of bias. And then The second thing is, I feel like taking a basic philosophy course and learning the differences between like abduction, induction, and deduction, or just learning like really basic like prop logic, stuff like that, I think would also be incredibly helpful, so that people can't be misled so easily by faulty logic or dumb numbers, or I hate to say it, like logical fallacies or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's certainly a lot to be said to this, and there is some empirical data that shows that this is pretty recent, that shows that belief in conspiracy theory does track with lesser abilities in terms of critical thinking.
Wait, that what with lesser? Say that one more time. Sorry.
So people that just aren't as good at critical thinking tend to be more conspiratorial in their.
Oh, sure, yeah, that would make sense.
That's
yeah,
pretty right. It's pretty new. However, and this hasn't been tested as much. But one of the surprising sort of findings that has occurred in the conspiracy theory research is that researchers really expected to show a strong correlation in lower intelligence being a predictor of conspiracy theory, and that's belief in conspiracy theory, and that's just not been borne out. There are lots of highly intelligent people that are really drawn to conspiracy theory. So it's not just the product of being like less intelligent, it might be the product of having less sort of intellectual tools to evaluate certain stories about the world.
Yeah, I think that people dramatically overestimate intelligence's like multifaceted capabilities and dramatically underestimate how important good epistemic tool sets are for navigating through the world. Like there are people that I've met, my stream makes fun of me all the time, maybe you even do, but like there are definitely people that I meet where it's like, this is a very smart person and I can tell this is a very intelligent person, but damn, they believe in so much stupid shit. And they don't believe in dumb shit because they're dumb, or they don't believe in certain conspiracies because they're stupid. Like you meet people with, like if we think of IQ or G as like horsepower, they have a lot of horsepower in their brains, but they are like they don't have the tool set to adequately evaluate the world around them. And then in some ways they become, because there are these few people that are like godlike conspiracy theorists. They're actually incredibly intelligent with the way that they move through their conspiracy theories, but the tool set they have is just so woefully inadequate for like delivering good conclusions about the world. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I think there's something to be said about this. But one thing I like about what you just said is that what we're really doing right now is we're kind of robbing the sort of moral or intellectual sort of weight from being a true believer in a conspiracy theory. Oftentimes, we think that somebody that believes in a conspiracy theory, there's something wrong with them, right? There's something intellectually wrong with them. There's something morally wrong with them. And that may not be, I don't think that that's the case at all. It might be that, they just need a better toolkit. Now, obviously, conspiracy theories can have like significantly negative impacts to the world. Like,
yeah.
The Trump ascendancy started with a conspiracy theory, right? It started with the
QAnon
Obama
and the Obama birth certificate shit and all that, yeah.
Right, so it can have an outsized impact, right? Obviously, Pizzagate had an impact at Common Pizza. January 6th ultimately boils down to conspiracy theory that had significant real-world impacts. But one thing that I like about what you're saying is that it's not really demonizing the person that holds a conspiracy theory, in saying that there's something intellectually broken about them or something morally broken about them. Although that could be the case, I think in most cases it's not the case. But let me just run something by you as far as a motivational story and see what you think, because I argue that the attraction to conspiracy theories that I myself feel. Now, again, I've already sort of self-identified as kind of a generalist. Like I pretty much don't take them seriously at all. But I feel the pull. I feel the attraction. I love to like read about, the flat Earth story of the world. I love to read about was 9/11 an inside job. I was a big fan of that early genre of the loose change documentary.
Oh, I remember that
and
shit,
Zeitgeist and all that stuff. There's something really appealing about it, and I can feel the draw of that, right? And it got me to thinking about, of course, my background is in philosophical aesthetics. I work in the philosophy of art. I think about stories, right? And I began to think about the kinds of stories that, a conspiracy theory really is, right? The kind of story that it is. And it reminds me a whole lot of detective fiction. And in this key sort of component, there's a philosopher called Alan Goldman who writes about the appeal of detective fiction. And basically, he says that the big attraction, the big draw of reading a mystery story is that you're using your reasoning faculties along with the detective, because part of the fun is figuring out the mystery, right?
Yeah.
To find the clues. And so he writes the detective sort of reasons as a scientist using abductive, inductive, and deductive reasoning, and arriving at conclusions on the testing hypotheses and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the difference between what the detective story, the mystery novel does, as opposed to the first 48.
As
So
opposed to the
mystery,
first 48?
right? That television show that talks about like a murder or something, right?
Oh, okay.
Um, so in a mystery novel, the most obvious clues are never the clues that lead to the culprit,
Mm-hmm.
right? Instead, we're
Fuck.
looking
I was just
we're
gonna say,
looking
yeah,
for
I was gonna guess ahead. Yeah, the point of the murder story, what I think is that like there is a crazy murder at the end. That's always the case, and there's always like a formulaic way to get there. That's never just gonna map onto like what happened in the real world scenario. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm cutting you off. Go ahead. Yeah.
right. So in the real world, we look at the direct evidence, right? We
Yeah.
consider this. But in the mystery novel, where the direct evidence is there, but it's largely a ruse because that would be a boring story.
Of
right?
course, yeah.
Like if it was just this again, if it was like the first 48, where the clues are pretty obvious, where
If you've ever seen like Scooby Doo, they go into a mansion and somebody's disappeared or murdered, and there's like a really grumpy asshole housekeeper that's so mean and rude, and it's not him because it's like so obvious. It's going to be like the friendly clerk at the desk or something, or like the sister that you would never suspect. Always, yeah.
Absolutely. So this is what's happening when we read a detective novel. Like we're looking for why does she make that offhand remark? Or why was that cup placed there on the table? Those are the things that really matter. And that's what we derive our inferences from.
Mm-hmm.
And this is exactly what happens, it seems to me, when we are considering conspiracy theories. First of all, we're participating as an interpreter, right?
Yeah.
Because, QAnon never explicitly, so if you look at the Q drops, the Q posts, there's the story is there, but it's never explicit. There's an interpretive element that I as the reader have to perform to interpret what's going on. Like there's vagaries, there's all kinds of clues, and that's part of the fun. People that come out of QAnon talk about this. Like I feel like I'm really part of something because I'm reasoning. I'm behaving as a detective.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's never the most obvious facts. We're basing our conclusions on the little details, on the small things, the things that so there's a famous paper that really brings philosophy of conspiracy theory into the end of the 20th century by Brian Keeley, and he points out that conspiracy theories rely on errant data. This is data that isn't accounted for by the official narrative, right?
Yeah.
So you might think of, for example, if you watch the Zapruder film in the JFK assassination, when JFK's car comes into Dealey Plaza, there's that individual that's standing there in black who opens an umbrella, right? And so the umbrella man, there's a whole mythology about this, right? The conspiracy theorists will make a lot of this, right? They'll be like, oh, this is obviously a signal. Here's what's going on here. Whereas the actual explanation for the umbrella man is much more mundane and has nothing to do with what's about to happen.
There's I don't know if you saw my show when I watched this. There's apparently a guy that goes through JFK videos. Somebody linked me a streamable, or it's a guy that did a video on the JFK stuff. There's a streamable that I got linked. I think it's a guy doing a 6-minute explanation on conspiracy theories, and he lays out a set of facts related to a murder, how there might be 5 or 6 or 7 facts, and he'll say that like a reasonable person coming with a clear mind might say that like, yeah, it's obvious that a murder occurred here. Now there might be a few facts that might be difficult to account for, but none of them are dispositive, or none of them like clearly demonstrate that like a murder didn't happen. But the conspiracy theorist might fixate on a couple facts that might be a bit difficult to explain, and those become like the central foundation of which they build a completely and totally new theory on. And then that's one aspect that plays into what you're saying. Then a second thing that's kind of funny is when you think about these conspiracy theories, I just saw someone in chat say, oh, so are these people like ignoring Occam's razor? And it's funny, but in a way, a conspiracy theorist gets to actually lean into Occam's razor in a weird I don't know if you say like an epistemic trick or like a verbal trick, to where you might say that like, for instance, like Epstein's death. Well, wouldn't it make more sense that like Epstein just committed suicide in prison, given all the facts or whatever? And then in their mind, they're thinking like, okay, well, what are the chances that those video recorders weren't recording? What are the chances that the officers didn't check him that night? What are the chances he's a billionaire? But wouldn't it just be simpler to think that like somebody actually planned for him to be killed? Even though a total collection of those facts would be a way more complicated story, because you're talking about so many people being involved. They actually Occam's razor their way into a more complicated description, because they don't take into account how complicated the actual description is due to the overlying narrative, which is also like an interesting trick, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, in this case, Occam's razor is in the eye of the beholder, right?
Yes,
Because one
yeah.
person's simple is another person's complicated.
Exactly. The
Um,
moon landing is also another really good example of that, to where it's counterintuitive, but the video technology at the time of the moon landing was actually really primitive. You would have to invent so many new technologies to fake that moon landing in terms of what video was capable at the time, that the simpler explanation is really to just shoot a rocket at the moon and get people to go on. It's far simpler of an explanation. But you can Occam's razor your way into thinking that the conspiracy theory is more explanatory, because just shooting a video at half speed is way simpler than developing all the new technology to get people into space on the moon we've never done it before, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Absolutely. So another example, just while we're on this point of this errant data, for example, so some weird things happened with the Oklahoma City bombing. For example, Timothy McVeigh, as he fled the scene in a car without license plates. He had a gun in the car, and yet he didn't resist arrest when he was pulled over for the no license plates. And so this is obviously just the product of, somebody that, was really wound up by doing this horrible destructive thing and didn't plan for afterwards.
Sure.
That's an easy explanation. But the conspiracy theorists will be like, why didn't he resist arrest? What's going on here? Why would he be so obvious in his escape? And so that builds, so those details are what's central to the theory. Another way to think about this errant data, often a conspiracy theory will rely on early data. So for example,
Oh, yes.
during the Sandy Hook school shooting, early reports, people that were on the scene while it was going on were saying there are more than one person in the building, right? And this is, the Alex Jones types will jump on this and they say this early data matters because this is before the fix was in.
Yeah.
Right.
And if nobody corrects it, going back to the other thing, if that story stands and nobody says anything, it's kind of out there, well, see, it's true, but nobody's talking about it. If they correct the story, of course they're correcting it. They were told to by their handlers. If the story's deleted because it was wrong, of course they deleted it. They're trying to hide the truth from us, right? The conclusion is predetermined based on the particular narrative that you subscribe to and the collection of facts that you found to support it, regardless of the authenticity of those facts or whether or not upon, further investigation they turned out to be true. Like the important thing is always the conclusion over the actual fact gathering process. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this brings me to kind of the sort of position that I'm currently trying to defend, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on this, because I do think it offers like a intervention strategy. So one of the things that Goldman says, to go back to that business about the mystery novel, is that the person that's reading a mystery novel, the difference between that and what goes on in sort of scientific reasoning in the real world is the person reading the mystery novel is behaving aesthetically. They're utilizing their imagination, right, to fill in the details. And that's part of the appeal, right? And I actually think that the appeal of conspiracy theories is largely an aesthetic one.
I 1,000,000,000% agree. Yeah, for sure.
And actually, I think that lots of our sort of ways of approaching the world have to do with aesthetics more than we'd like to admit, but that's another topic. But I think that the conspiracy theory is a certain kind of story, and I think this provides a much simpler sort of story that we can tell about the motivation towards conspiracy theories, because all it boils down to is that there are certain people that have a kind of taste for a certain kind of story, right? And it takes all that sort of like loading about like, are they morally or epistemically deficient away. And what the only mistake, well, not the only mistake, but the chief mistake that the conspiracy theorist is making is that they are mistaking epistemic practice for aesthetic practice. They're reversing them.
Yeah.
Right? They are attracted to what they regard as the most beautiful story, and they confuse that with the most true story.
Yeah. This is always my issue when I talk to people, is it's not even the belief pattern or the belief system. It's just that they're mistaking it for something else. Like if I speak to somebody and they tell me, I don't know if you saw me go through what I regard as like these like constellations of beliefs that people inherit from social groups or whatever. If I talk to somebody and they say, and I'm like, why do you believe all this shit? Like, how could you believe this and that and that and that? And they're like, well, I'm part of a social group. This is literally the same thing that all of us believe in. And it's pretty important that we all have kind of a cohesive belief system so that we can all kind of like hang out together and, vibe together and share stories and talk and get along. Then I'd be like, oh, well, okay, fine. I understand. I think it's dumb and we can argue about that. But like, yeah, at least you have a good grasp of why you think the things you do. The issue that I run into is people confuse, right, aesthetics with epistemics, and they're like, oh, why do I believe these things? Because logically, ironically enough, because I guess epistemics gets co-opted by aesthetics, and people use epistemology as an aesthetic just in a bad way, right? Where they pretend that they're being logical, they pretend that they're being rational, when in reality they're entirely driven by emotion or aesthetic. And right. I think that's the most frustrating thing. It's like when people say like, oh, I'm a centrist, or oh, I don't have a political bias. These people are almost universally always anti-establishment figures that have a strong support for anti-establishment populist type leaders like Donald Trump or people like Andrew Tate or whatever. They always, it's crazy that all of the very independent, very centrist people have almost like a uniform set of beliefs. I'm like, how does that happen? Yeah, but it's the co-opting, because people realize that being rational and being logical would be cool. So that rational and logical point of view is just adopted as an aesthetic and then abused as such. Yeah.
Yeah. So before let's pause for a second, because there's something that I don't want to forget. That's something that was really important that you brought up with Candace, that you brought up with Alex Jones, that's actually borne out in the literature. So one of the things that you said, and again, I'll come back to the aesthetic epistemic stuff, but one of the things that you said is that you worry about these kind of narratives because they're really disempowering to people that hear them. And this is interesting because the literature on motivation towards, for example, political action in true believers of conspiracy theories shows that believers in conspiracy theories are demotivated to participate politically. Yeah. So this starts in 1994. I think there was a study on the psychological impact of JFK, the film. And people that watched the film reported they were much less likely to vote. Because why the fuck? Why would I even bother?
Yeah.
Because
both parties are the same. Every candidate wants the same thing. They're all controlled by the Jews or the Rothschild or whatever the fuck anyway. Yeah.
Right. And as a result, if you convince people that conspiracy theories are true, you're actually going to disempower them. At least that's what the data suggests. Now, I thought something was changing with things like Pizzagate and things like the January 6th, riot. I thought, well, maybe there's something we need to study now that political engagement is going up as a result of these conspiracy theories. But then, and I don't know how reliable I take this, but I saw a report from CNN that looked at the voting records for those people that were, involved in January 6th and found that most of them didn't vote at all.
Yep. I think that was also the same for, I don't want to misquote this, but it was in Seattle or Portland. Let me see if I can Google this. BLM activists arrested voting records, where I want to say it was a really low percentage of them that had voted as well, because you were able to look up, I think, in one of these states, if the name is public, you can look up a voter roll and you can see if they voted. It won't tell you who they voted for, but you can see a vote. And it was like, I want to say it was like 15 or 20% of like the people in this crowd that were politically active, right? They were activists, they were out protesting, had actually voted. Yeah. I'm not gonna be able to find this. I might be making this up, so if somebody can find it and prove it to me so that I'm not just like repeating some bullshit I read on a headline, but I thought I saw this like during the BLM protests a few years ago. But yeah, go ahead.
It sounds, it sounds legitimate, at least, and that's what the data tends to predict. So it seems to be just a strange strategy that the Trump team would employ to talk so much about the rigging of the election, because if the data is true, if this is if this is what happens psychologically, that it's likely they're going to just convince people to disenfranchise themselves. They're not going to. Why would I vote? Why would I bother? Because it's all a con job anyway. So that's one thing, and I definitely wanted to point that out because I didn't want to forget that, because you were really onto something when you point to this, and I just don't think that somebody like Candace Owens has thought that through. I want to be careful about, at least right now, I want to be careful about what I say about her. I know that you all are in kind of a dust up on Twitter, but I just, these kind of narratives demotivate people. It's just a psychological fact. And if you want people to get out and vote and you want to change the world, you cannot feed these people, feed conspiracy theorists this diet, or else it will continue to erode their confidence in public life.
Yeah, I agree. Have you
change the world like that?
Have you ever heard of League of Legends?
I have. I've seen the obsession, but I have not played it or been associated with it.
Oh, okay. Fine. It's just funny when you talk about demotivating. There's a conspiracy theory called Fixed 50, and the idea is that when you're playing ranked games, the ranking algorithm will always try to make it so that you win one and lose one. And people will get like trapped in certain elos for a long time, and they'll just spam like fixed 50, fixed 50. Like, I could never win this game. Like, of course, the algorithm is working against me. I can't do it. And that's just it's a real world example, like the really demotivating effect of a certain conspiracy theory on like a player's motivation to even try to win. Somebody in chat asked, is religion a conspiracy theory? Something that I would probably say is, while we're talking about, or you are talking about how conspiracy theories, or me too, are talking about conspiracy theories can be demotivating, I don't necessarily think that's intrinsic to a conspiracy theory. I don't know if all conspiracy theories have to be demotivating. I'm sure that we could probably think of some conspiracy theories that are motivating. It's just the current set right now, especially the political ones, seem to be demotivating. The thing that I can think of the most on that is, the two examples I can think of is, one, growing up Catholic, I'd always had repeated to me from teachers, priests, and my parents, God helps those who help themselves. There's that long joke about the guy who turns down the boat, the helicopter, the whatever else when his house is flooding, and then when he goes to heaven, he asks God, why didn't you help me? And he's like, well, I sent you a boat, I sent you a helicopter, I sent you people, and you turned it down. So in that sense, I can see like religion being, even if you might regard religion as a type of conspiracy theory, although I don't really think it fits here as a conspiracy theory, like opposition to official story, conspiracy between people, sinister element. Like even these things that may or may not be true can also be motivating things as well. It just depends on the particular type of conspiracy theory, I guess. Yeah, but like you said, to reiterate, the one that you're talking about, oh yeah, the idea of karma or whatever, can be a motivating one. Yeah. But the political conspiracy theories that have these like overarching narratives of like secret evil people that are constantly working against people, I think that there's an attraction towards keeping these as amorphous as possible, and because it means you can never be wrong because they're unfalsifiable. It means that you're never going to get called out on making a bad prediction because every prediction like is in line with your narrative, and you can continually harp on the same thing over and over again while making money off of it and never getting called out. So I think that these types of conspiracy theories are particularly bad. Yeah.
So one way, this really actually is really important. One way that I have started my class on conspiracy theories historically is actually to start in the Old Testament book of Job, in the Hebrew Bible, because Job, as you know, tells the story of the righteous man who suffers for no reason at all except that Yahweh wants to prove to Satan that Job is faithful. Yeah. Right? Job never knows what's going on. He never finds out through the narrative. And what I want to suggest is that this idea of this divine conspiracy is more palatable to people than accepting the fact that shit just happens sometimes.
Yeah.
Right. So
that's impossible, especially if it doesn't have a good explanation. Or somebody might just do some shit because they're mad or upset. That's like unacceptable to a lot of people. That can't be the case. There has to be a narrative explanation for why a particular person did a particular thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and that I do think that a big part of the appeal in the West of conspiracy theorizing is these deeply embedded narratives about the divine conspiring against us. It's not just in the Hebrew Bible, but it's in Greek tragedy. It's it's all over the place. And so it stands to reason that in the West this would be something we really adopt. Now, conspiracy theorizing isn't exclusive to the West, but it does have a unique kind of manifestation, I think, in the West, and I think a big part of it is our religious heritage. We're much more comfortable believing that the gods are conspiring against us than we are to believe that just the world's just a random ball of chaos. So back to this business about confusing epistemic practice with aesthetic practice. I want to say that, and this is something you already suggested, this is not something that's exclusive to conspiracy theorizing. Yeah. If you read any philosophy of science, there is a strong strain of talking about more beautiful theories being more successful.
Yeah, I brought up as an example that the physicist, the dream of having the one theory to explain everything, to unite gravity and quantum mechanics, that's like the primary driving, motivating goal in a lot of physics right now, or at least theoretical stuff, yeah.
I mean, think about the appeal of things like the double helix of the DNA or the Copernican model of the solar system. These seem to map onto, in addition to like having empirical success, they seem to map onto like our aesthetic sensibilities, right? And so it is not uncommon for us to refer to scientific theories as beautiful or harmonious,
or elegant.
Whereas these are typically like terms we would use to describe aesthetic properties. And so I think what this does is it points to how easy it is to confuse epistemic practice with aesthetic practice. Like, it's just really easy to like think that, and this goes back to Plato, right? The true, the good, and the beautiful are supposed to be unified. Yeah. Right. And in all of these cases, I do think that we're often too hasty when we accept aesthetic properties as indicators of something's truth value. And I think that this is what's happening for the conspiracy theorists, but I do want to say it happens in all kinds of domains. There is some there may be like a fundamental sort of cognitive mechanism that explains this. There's some research in what we would call processing fluency, which basically means how easy it is for you to grasp something quickly.
Yeah.
That you automatically assume that things that you process more fluently are true.
Yeah.
Right. So, and there's actually research that links certain aesthetic features with processing fluency. So, for example, phrases that rhyme are often more regarded as more true than phrases that don't. Like a stitch in time saves 9, right? Like these truisms.
Yeah, how important are slogans and everything for political parties and for candidates and everything, yeah.
A big part of this is that these are really easy for the brain to process. So and again, we connect things that are easy for us to process with things that are obviously true.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think this is a big part of what explains why our sort of aesthetic appreciation of, in this case, a conspiracy theory can be easily slipped into an explanation for the world. What we're attracted to is the quote unquote beauty of the conspiracy theory, and we just mistake it as saying something factual about the world.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of what I've been on about lately in my research and trying to draw up kind of an aesthetics of conspiracy. And I talk about a number of aesthetic features that we find in conspiracy theories, but I also talk about what might be an intervention strategy for conspiracy theorists that works better than counter argument. Now, I could talk about the aesthetic features, but would you rather? Are you interested more in the strategy, or what would you? Where would you?
You hit me with both. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
When you bring up, this is like very loosely related, but do you know Alex, the cosmic skeptic guy?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just like this is barely related to what we're saying, but I just thought it was funny that I think he was talking to Chris Williamson, and they spoke about like the unlikely ending of some people. Like sometimes a guy might fear the number 20 his whole life, and then when he turns 20 years old, he dies, and it's like, wow, what a crazy coincidence or whatever. Like sometimes life rhymes like that. And I think Alex went on to say, like, I'm not going to remember the example, but it was something along those like, yeah, Einstein hated oranges his whole life, and it was insane that he always had a fear of oranges, and it was really crazy because he died, and Chris Williamson was like, wow, what happened? Did he like choke on an orange or what happened? He was like, no, he just had a heart attack. And like that was the end, but like the way the conversation went, like he's already like primed to believe a certain thing. It was just a funny like reminder of like that type of like the detective story, and there must be like a satisfying end or conclusion, and there's not always. Right. Or sometimes I'm reminded of Law and Order SVU. I used to like this show because sometimes the endings of these episodes were deeply unsatisfying. Like they just wouldn't find the guy, or they'd find the guy, but you wouldn't be able to explain all of the crime or whatever. A few of these episodes, like, oh, that's a very interesting, unsatisfying ending, and I guess kind of like maps on to the real world where sometimes it's not always like the most satisfying explanation. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Right, and I think that would explain why people might be polarized by a show like The Wire, for example.
Oh, yeah.
There's just so much of it's just down to randomness.
Sure.
The characters that you love have these just really anticlimactic deaths, and so people might find that unsatisfying differently than they would be satisfied by like the 1980s sort of action movie. Even that had a sad ending, it's going to feel that it resolves a little bit differently than a show that's more realistic. So I think I've identified at least 5 sort of aesthetic elements of what I call a genre of conspiracy theorizing, and I'll just go through them real quick. We can talk about it if you want.
Okay.
But none of this is going to be revelatory to you. This is all things you probably noticed. So, for example, the first thing that I kind of point to is this interrogative rhetoric of evidence and explanation. So the idea of just asking questions, right? So in some of the internet forums, this comes to be referred to as jacking off, right? JAQ, and think about what Candace was saying, even in your conversation with her.
Isn't it weird that he has 6 passports? Yeah. Like, what the fuck am I supposed to take? Yeah, that's of course, yeah.
That's not saying
Isn't it weird that we don't know how he made his money? Yeah. The most frustrating thing, too, I hate it when people do this, is they do this incredibly intentionally, but then they deny the implication. I hate that. Oh, my God. Because then whenever you try to... There was a really famous interview. Jordan Peterson does master classes on how to do this. Jordan Peterson gave an interview on, was it Channel 4? I don't remember. Some British show, and there was a lady who like was very obviously picking up on every implication, but as soon as she would try to nail him down on like, well, are you saying that women should do this or that? He's like, well, I didn't say that. I didn't. And technically he never did, but the implication is blaringly obvious by the end of his descriptive statements, but he would never actually make the prescriptive one. And then the lady was just getting mind the whole time. And when you see that plan in real time, you're like, oh, I see what's happening here. Yeah, geez.
It serves two functions, right? It insulates the person asking the questions from any responsibility.
Yep.
But it also has that sort of detective pull, right? Because you think you're the interpreter when you're answering that question for yourself, right? Why is it that, this person has 6 passports, and so it brings you into the mystery, right? So that's part of the appeal, I think. So that's the just asking questions criteria. What else? Let's see. Oh, there's this. Wait, real quick. When you bring up a thing, I want to bring up a way to counter it, a way that I try to counter this, and then you can tell me if it works or not, and then we can go through each of these, because I'm curious. This is really good stuff for me to have in mind. I find that the strongest way to counter the just asking questions narrative is to just ask a question and force an answer. So, and I didn't do this with Candace because she was incredibly fragile, and I think she would have ran if she did it. But for instance, if I was talking to somebody in a more aggressive conversation, they're like, well, why did Epstein have 6 passports? My question to them would be, well, you tell me, why do you think he had 6 passports? So rather than them getting to ask a question and make an implication, you force them to either take a hard position or at least admit that they don't have one. Do you have any other solutions for dealing with that kind of just asking questions thing? It depends. So if you're having a one-on-one conversation or argument with someone, that you might be able to persuade, I think that's a really good strategy. If you were talking to Alex Jones and this is a strategy he's going to use over and over, what I would do in my opening statement is to predict this is what you are going to hear. And every time he does it in your rebuttal, you reply, I told you he was going to raise these questions and not answer them. Okay. And so rhetorically, that's going to really weaken the effect, because it starts to look a lot more like a trope, like a convention of a kind of story. Right?
Oh, did you see Chris Christie do this to Marco Rubio?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So it's exactly that. I understand what you're saying. Okay. Gotcha. Yep. Okay.
So the second feature and again, this is nothing new, this is nothing super revelatory, is the diction of conspiracy theories. Often conspiracy theories will be full of terms that are both large and vague. So international finance, big pharma, the New World Order, the deep state, the Illuminati Jacobean conspiracy, right? So there are these terms that are both mysterious, they point to mysterious, nefarious groups, but they also really play on these mechanisms in our brains that are associated with awe, because they're almost always confer a kind of largeness, a kind of size. The deep state, big pharma,
big anything. I find whenever I'm talking to anybody, if they say big anything, it's almost always it's going to be something stupid. Yeah. Right.
And there's a great example from the PBD podcast about how these terms kind of work. So I think he had a former Republican strategist, the founder of the Lincoln Project, Steve Schmidt, on his podcast a while back, and they had this giant argument about the deep state. And interestingly, Schmidt turned the question back on PBD. He said, "Who is the deep state?" And you would expect the PBD would start to identify people that are actually involved in the government.
Yeah.
But he began to talk about
the media,
Klaus Schwab.
Oh, okay, yeah.
What's Klaus Schwab have to do with the deep state?
The World Economic Forum, the UN, all these stupid, yeah.
But it's not directly related to what we typically mean by the deep state. We typically mean by the deep state individuals that are not elected in the U.S. government that are working towards some other end. But what this shows is how porous these terms really are. That anybody that's bad just kind of gets plunked into one of these categories. So deep state just means big pharma, just means, whatever. International finance, although that has a more anti-Semitic overtone usually. So that's one of the mechanisms that I think, makes these narratives really porous, keeps accusations vague, right? Because, I disprove that Bill Gates is part of the deep state, but that doesn't mean the deep state doesn't exist, right?
Sure.
And so I can escape sort of that. But again, I do think that the big part of the attraction is that it works on these mechanisms associated with awe.
Okay.
Awe is a typically associated with learning, right? When we experience awe, it's often correlated with a desire to learn something new. So there are a lot of studies that will, sort of initiate awe in individuals, and will ask them, what would you prefer to do right now? You want to go watch a movie, or you want to go to a science museum? You know, and a lot of times people say, I want to go to the science museum because I want to learn about this, right?
Sure.
And so I think a big part of the appeal of conspiracy theories, using these terms that sort of work on these awe mechanisms, is that it encourages you to dive further into the conspiracy theory, down the rabbit hole.
Okay.
Right? It makes it more attractive in this way. So that's another feature. The diction that's used. Another feature that's used a lot is characterization, and by this, what I refer to specifically is the tragic hero trope. So think about how John F. Kennedy is portrayed in JFK. He's portrayed as someone who's morally upright. He's standing against the advances of the military-industrial complex, even though perhaps it will lead to his demise.
Sure.
But his unwitting commitment to this value ultimately is what leads to his destruction.
Yeah, Donald Trump is taking a huge risk to his reputation. He's putting himself out there by running for office. The Tates and even Tate himself cast himself in this light. I'm taking a stand by standing up against the deep state. They're going to try to destroy me with the legal system. They're going to come after me. Bernie Sanders risked it all to stand against the DNC and blah, blah. Yeah, it's always these types of, the narrativizing is very, very, very important, yeah. Even when, especially in the case of Andrew Tate, it doesn't fit at all, even if it doesn't match up to anything, yeah.
Absolutely. So you can see this in conspiracy narrative rising about Timothy McVeigh, about David Koresh, about all these people that were part of these conspiracy theories. Now, there's also another variation on this, and often the actual creator of the conspiracy theory takes on this tragic role. So Alex Jones will often portray himself this way. I don't know if you remember the COVID pandemic documentary, but Judy Mikovits, the virologist who advocates for, or claims that the COVID vaccine is, going to kill us all or something. She portrays herself as a victim of Anthony Fauci's persecution, right? So, so again, this is a really popular trope, and this just plays into the last 2,500 years of Western sort of storytelling, right? The tragic hero, for however you want to explain that's appealing, right? The tragic hero is something that persists in fiction to this day. It's something we just really are attracted to. We're drawn to
underdogs and everything. Yeah, for sure.
Whether that be in Romeo and Juliet or The Crucible or Death of a Salesman, this tragic figure is something that compels our interest. And so conspiracy theories will often play on this trope. So that's the tragic hero sort of feature. But I think perhaps the most attractive sort of feature of this genre is the do-it-yourself character of conspiracy theorizing.
Okay. So wait, is this still falling under your the third part of
No, this is number 4.
Okay, number 4. Wait. Okay, for the last one, how do you fight against bullshit characterizations? What do you think is a good?
So I would simply, and this is something I would not necessarily be arguing against these characterizations of these people. Instead, and I may be playing my hand a little bit. Instead, I would simply ask. This goes for both the protagonist and the antagonist in the conspiracy theory. I would ask more and more questions about these people's character, like what motivates them to do this. So if they start demonizing George Soros, for example, well, why would Soros do this? Does he need more money? Does he need more power? Just ask these general questions, and there's a reason why. But then I would ask them to compare John F. Kennedy Jr. with Timothy McVeigh. Like, well, how are they similar? How are they different? Like, if they believe in both of these conspiracy theory stories, right? So that's a strategy that I would employ. The last sort of feature, well, not the last, but there's 2 more, but the last one I'll talk about in any depth is this kind of do-it-yourself character of conspiracy theorizing. This business where conspiracy theory feels like it's.
Sorry, go ahead. When you say do it yourself, I'm thinking of don't trust these guys, do your own research, or dumb things, but I don't know if that's where you're going. Sorry, go ahead.
That's definitely part of it, but also think about the way that conspiracy theories are conveyed. They're often conveyed, in the early days, they were conveyed in homemade sort of newsletters. They were conveyed in zines, like you'd see in the punk rock scene, like people would photocopy things and hand them out, right? Even now, if you want to learn about conspiracy theories, you don't go to a slick website that looks like Alex Jones InfoWars. You go to 4chan, right?
Or Medium or Substack or or YouTube video. Even you mentioned that Zeitgeist thing or the Loose Change. These were done in YouTube videos way back in the day. Yeah.
there is like a do-it-yourself, like man on the street kind of vibe, right? That's associated with this. I was in Roswell, New Mexico, a couple of years ago, and I happened into a shop that sells rocks like geodes and things like this. And it was run by this evangelical Christian. And of course, Roswell is, I don't know if you've ever been out there, but it's a town that's sold out to like the UFO narrative. Everything is alien, everything. You know, even the high school mascot's the invaders, right? So in this store, this guy had a bunch of evangelical tracts, like pamphlets describing Christianity. But the way that he would hook you in is through the UFO narratives. And basically, the argument in these tracts were that, you know, UFOs are actually demons that are come to deceive us. And he had this one world order kind of vibe to it. But these were homemade. You could tell he made them himself and went to Office Depot and had them printed.
Gotcha.
And
Something
so
that's interesting on this that reminds me of this real quick is from what I've seen, I've never seen Scientologists recruit out in public as Scientologists. They usually have little stands where they'll say like, oh, come and get your stress read here. And then here's a book on Dianetics and you can read about this. It's never like, we're the Church of Scientology and we're recruiting. It seems like a much smaller, more basic kind of, I don't know if I'd necessarily say do it yourself kind of thing, but it seems like it's a lot smaller than what the entire Church of Scientology actually implies. Yeah.
Absolutely. Even conspiracy theorizing is even associated with certain fonts, right?
Okay.
Think about like the X-Files font, that Courier kind of font, right? Like it looks like it was produced on a typewriter. And it's because the long history of conspiracy theorizing is publishing in these sort of homemade venues, right? And I think that gives it a kind of countercultural appeal, right? It makes it brings the reader into this story as an interpreter, because you're not being fed through a publisher, you're not being fed through the standard sort of media channels. It feels like you are part of it, and I think that's a big part of the appeal, right? So this is this do-it-yourself element, and then there's one more element that we don't have to talk about a lot. But
real quick on the last one, what do you do to point that out or counter that, I guess?
I would do a lot of, I work in aesthetics, so a lot of what I do is just describing what I see. Like, oh, I really like this choice here. Like, what do you think they picked this font choice? Like, look at this image here. I would do a lot of just, sort of aesthetic analysis of what I'm looking at, putting aside any of the arguments, right? Just drawing attention to certain features of the things that are being consumed.
Okay.
So that's that, and that kind of goes back to this tragic hero kind of trope as well.
Gotcha.
Just draw the reader to the conventions that they're looking at. So the last one is visualizability, and this one's probably maybe the most powerful. Lots of conspiracy theories contain lots of charts, and even the language that's used to describe conspiracy theories. So you'll hear, for example, Pat Robertson describe the New World Order as circles within circles, right?
Okay.
So there's a lot of shape talk, right? And I think that also constitutes a lot of appeal. Like that's also an aesthetic appeal, like lots of charts and mapping and that kind of thing. And for people that are inclined to a certain kind of puzzling, doing puzzles, it really is appealing, like to see this. And so that's the last element. That honestly, in what I'm writing about this, I'm still working through that part of it, because I need to think about the way that these charts and what these maps and charts and signs signal to the readers.
I feel like I don't know if this necessarily goes along with the last one, but it's funny that it feels like sometimes people can, as they're talking, they'll create their own puzzle, and then they'll give you the solution. And when they give you the solution to like a dumb word game or something they played, it feels very satisfying. Like it makes sense. And you're like, oh my God. Like somebody will say something like, yeah, like there are people that want to destroy. There are people that want to deconstruct. There are people that want to demolish. And these are the Democrats. And it'll be like, oh shit. And you have this like mind blowing, like, oh my God, where they're like creating a puzzle in front of you and solving it. You're like, oh my God, it actually makes perfect sense. And seeing people fall into something like, bro, come on, kill me. I saw a really funny Instagram reel like 3 days ago where it was like every red pill podcast today. And it was just like a guy doing like a minute of like these stupid fucking word wheels or whatever, where they set these things up and then they knock the dominoes down and an audience is like, oh shit, it makes so much sense. Yeah.
So with these kind of elements in mind, let's and this is something I'm still trying to develop, and I'd really like to partner with somebody who does XFI, so experimental philosophy, to do some tests. because I think that I have an intervention strategy that might be more effective than counter argument. Because as you know, counter argument does nothing.
Okay.
Like or little. I mean, over time, counter argument can be effective for sure. Like building relationships. There's some psychological indicators that show that conspiracy theorists are often high on this domain of character called anomie, which basically is like a feeling of isolation from the world, or a feeling of the world's against me. And so if you can invite people into the community, oftentimes you can erode conspiracy theories, but that takes a long time. But what I want to suggest is if I'm right about the appeal of conspiracy theories being largely aesthetic, then perhaps we ought to approach these things, instead of offering counter argument, as aesthetic artifacts. So think about this, and you're a musician. So I don't know if you've ever heard a band that you really loved, and then someone who's a fellow musician points out something that they rely on technically, and it just kind of ruins the band. So for example, in the Beatles music, I had one sort of a kind of appreciation for the music of the Beatles until I learned about the use of the major 3 chord and in the chord progression, right? So normally the third is a minor, or at least or diminished. I can't remember in a progression, but in a lot of Beatles songs, like "I Want to Hold Your Hand" or in "Yesterday," they jump to a major third, right? And so it's an interesting sort of. It comes from the folk tradition, right? And it's an interesting sort of technical, variation on like the standard sort of pop theme, and is part of what makes those songs catchy. But once I heard it, that's all I could hear.
Interesting. Right? Okay.
And so, because I recognized this convention, some of the magic just kind of went out of the Beatles songs, right? Some of the appeal, like it didn't all. Like I still like the Beatles. I still find them, I still like a lot of the music. Find it really interesting. But the point is that once we start sort of laying the skeleton bare on the conventions of these conspiracy theories, once we really start drawing attention to these conventions, it starts to become a lot more like a story and less like an explanation of real world events, right? And so I think that it sort of erodes the conspiracy theorist's confidence if you can begin to point out the commonalities of all these conventions and all the stories that they're citing. So here we.
I think that for that to work, I think you have to go one step further, which is something that I think I try to do, in that it's not enough to show the commonalities or the skeleton, because I think that if they're fully bought in, they'll say like, well, of course there's commonalities. Of course they all share something. It's because it's true, obviously. Like math has a lot of commonalities, or, science has a lot of commonalities. I think the next step that you have to go is to show not only do they all have commonalities, but all of these things, in my world, I try to say all these things fail to make predictions. That when you look at all of these people that have all these conspiracies and they make all these predictions, they're always wrong. There was no 50-state landslide. That was bullshit. Trump was indicted. These things were never dropped. These things, like the predictions about all the COVID and vaccine stuff, none of those came true. There is no like worldwide vaccine mandate or vaccine passports or all the people dying, blah, blah. Like none of these things happen. I feel like that's the next step, because I think if you just point out commonalities, I think people will just like nod and go like, well, of course, yeah, there's a common structure. There is among all true things, right? Or what do you think?
So this is an excellent point. And I do think that this might be a little more effective, but I do think that it's something that would take place over time, right? So for example, when somebody pointed out this bit about the Beatles to me, it didn't immediately sort of kill it, but over time it started to just become conventional. Here's that major 3 again. Here we go. And so this is, I do think that over time these conventions can just become so obvious that it just becomes kind of memey, and people that are really interested in something new and interesting, which people have argued that conspiracy theorists aren't. That's part of the reason that they find these stories, because they rely on these tropes. But actually there's some interesting sort of fluency research, processing fluency research, that shows that you can reverse fluency's effect, right? So if you tell people that, look, processing fluency says that if you hear something rhyme, you're going to automatically think it's true. If you tell them that before you give them the test, they'll automatically assume that everything that rhymes is false.
Sure.
Right? So you're just turning it on its head, right? And so I think that part of my strategy involves sort of making those conventions really obvious, right? And that means getting people to talk about, again, just asking questions, getting people to talk about these tragic heroes, getting people to talk about this do-it-yourself quality, just really sort of involving themselves in the conventions to a degree that, now again, there are lots of people that love, standard sort of conventional storytelling, right? Like murder mysteries, even though they know all the tropes, they love them. But they're going to treat them with a different kind of, it's kind of one of those things. Like when I listen to a band that I used to love as a kid. So I always tell this story about when I was 10 years old, I first heard Def Leppard, and I thought this was amazing. This is just amazing, pop rock music. And I still kind of have an attraction to Def Leppard, but then I heard Iron Maiden, and then I heard other bands beyond that. And so, while I was attracted, I definitely sort of put it in this cognitive place, right? And I suspect that that's what could happen with conspiracy theorists as well. That the more we sort of really harp on these conventions, and that these stories rely on these conventions, and the more that these conspiracy theorists try to tell sort of new and inventive stories. So for example, imagine a conspiracy theorist willing to bite the bullet about the just asking questions stuff. Instead of just asking questions, I'm going to make assertions. Suddenly they find their assertions getting knocked down all over the place, right? And so this is a strategy that we might use to erode the conspiracy theorists' faith in these kinds of narratives.
Okay.
And so again, but what do you think? Again, this is something I'd still like to test, and it's something that's still, in my mind, a little bit on the cutting edge of things. And I will say that, like, all the psychological research that's been done, and there's a good deal since the late 20th century. There's a good deal that's been done. None of it has really produced a very effective sort of intervention strategy.
Well, I think the problem with intervention for conspiracy theories is it's a lot like solving poverty. Like, solving poverty requires structured families, good education, good employment opportunities, good city plan. There are ways to do it, but you have to hit it from like 15 different incredibly macro and then a ton of different micro angles for all of it to come together, because a lot of it is kind of self-reinforcing, or a lot of it like feedbacks into itself. I think the issue with a lot of conspiracy theories is a person who believes in certain conspiracy theories, they don't just have this one mental deficiency or this one like weird conspiracy, and then the rest of their life is completely and totally normal and comporting to every other logical norm that we would hope a person would. Generally, this will run concurrent with, they also have a certain political belief system. They also have a group of friends that believes the things that they believe. They consume a certain type of media that reinforces their beliefs. They might have personally staked out positions that now they historically agree with that are part of their psyche or character. That when you're trying to break somebody out of these things, you're not just fighting against the logic or just fighting against the conspiracy. You're also fighting against all of those other things that are running concurrently. So it's like you have to take like this multifaceted approach in order to deal with it. Because in some cases, I think unfortunately, that like when you break people out of concentration camps, you break out people that are starving, that if you give them a bunch of food, I think you can kill them. Are you aware of this?
Yes.
Yeah, because they're so starved or malnourished. I don't know what the exact physiological process is, but they can die if they overconsume food. I think the same can be said for people that are kind of like epistemically deficient in these areas, that if you start to break them out of certain areas, you'll know more about this than me. But in my mind, when you talk about like cognitive not impairment, not deficiencies, not distortions, cognitive dissonance. When you have these cognitive dissonances, there's like, in my mind, there's two big ways that you can resolve these. You either change your mind or you change the facts. And I think that the default is to change the facts. People typically won't change their mind. They'll just start to pick different facts or whatever. And I think that your inclination to do one or the other depends on the types of facts you're attacking and the types of social groups that you're in. So if you have a really effective rhetorical way of hitting somebody over like a certain particular conspiracy theory, that cognitive dissonance is going to grow to an extreme amount. And I think more likely than not, human beings tend to choose less friction over more friction. I think that in order to resolve the cognitive dissonance, they're just going to shut that out completely, and they're just going to run completely deeper into their thing. That's why when I talk to people, I've got to be so careful sometimes that if I'm too harsh, then they just get driven away completely. So the most effective interventions in some ways might be the least effective, because it means that people will never explore that route again because of the social and all the other consequences that it would incur if they would actually change their mind. I'm just like hypothesizing. There's just like a feeling that I have relating to it.
Sure.
But
So there's a couple of things to say here. Obviously, there are lots of forces that sort of are visited on people that we don't have control over. All we can control is how we talk to people. Mm-hmm. And what I want to say is that obviously, and I think you would agree, that obviously, and there's a difference in talking to Alex Jones for an audience than talking to your friend who happens to be in the grip of QAnon or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think a better rhetorical strategy in dealing with a conspiracy theorist is simply to listen to what they have to say and say, that's a really good story. And then perform a kind of aesthetic and literary analysis of the story. Right? Mm-hmm. And to ask them to talk a lot about the conventions that make up the story. Again, because the more we lay bare those conventions, I think the the more that a person can see that,
Sure.
oh, I really
Well,
aesthetically appreciate this,
yeah.
but I don't know if it maps onto the real world.
I think another thing
Um,
you have to be really careful about that, and I've discovered this is going to depend on the power level of the conspiracy theorists that I'm talking to, is sometimes if you ask people to flesh things out more, sometimes that can backfire. Because there might be scenarios where if you look at the true accounting of facts and the true story, there's just not a great explanation or it's unexplainable. And I think anytime you're arguing against a conspiracy theorist that is offering an explanation that comports with their narrative, and you have to admit honestly that you don't have one, I think you come off looking weaker in those circumstances than not.
that's what's that guy Darth Dawkins? That's his strategy about religion, right?
Correct. The presuppositionalist.
Oh, that's right. You don't have a story to tell about the world, so obviously mine's true.
Hmm.
um, it's an interesting sort of rhetorical strategy. So that is something for sure to be aware of, I think. So that's sort of my spiel. I'm still working through some of the particulars, but I'm wondering if some of this stuff could be brought to bear in interactions that you might have online with conspiracy theorists, really just drilling into the conventions more than I say that, but I think it's really important in online debate for the facts to be put out there. I do think that if you're debating Nick Fuentes or you're debating a conspiracy theorist
Hmm.
that's saying something really damaging, I think it's really important to answer them point by point.
For sure.
Although I know that they're never going to have a come to Jesus, altar call moment,
Yeah.
in the call.
And then you also
It's
have
just not
to,
gonna
going
happen.
through the facts is also hard because like people will also undermine sources of facts that there's this paper I reference sometimes that I read that goes the difference between like echo chambers versus epistemic bubbles, where the author
Right.
of the paper talks about an epistemic bubble is just like, oh, you get news from a certain place, and if you give somebody new news, it can break them out of that because they're like, oh, I haven't seen this before. Whereas echo chambers are so much more damaging because not only do they suffer from all of the downsides of the epistemic bubbles, they also seek to actively discredit voices external to that epistemic bubble. So not only will they only see a certain set of news, they're also preconditioned to disbelieve contradicting news. So those people are even harder to reach because now if somebody wants to say, oh, well, vaccines are going to kill everybody, and it's like, okay, well, look at the data. That's not supporting it. Oh, well, of course the data doesn't show that. Why would I trust the academic institutions that are all controlled by big pharma and the deep state? And it's like, oh, well, fuck.
Absolutely. So, see, you should talk to. I think that paper is written by T. Wen, and he's got a really interesting approach to sort of public philosophy. You should definitely have a conversation with him. He wrote a great book about games, where he talks about games in terms of agency as art. It would be really interesting to have. You should have a conversation with him. But yeah, a lot of his work really does map onto things that we're talking about. How we're deal with misinformation. How do we deal with these? This. What do we do in a free society? In a democratic society where everybody gets a say. He works a lot in that area. So he'd be a great person to sort of have a chat with. So do you have any other sort of questions or comments about the conspiracy theory piece? Because I have like two things to say about all this business about higher ed and the cost of higher ed and that kind of thing. There's some canards that Candace raised that,
Um,
that ought to be said.
Not unless you've got something else. Not that I can think of. I'd be really curious if you guys ever test on this because you fuckers just like to write papers to each other all day. I'd really like to see some experimentation on this, like actually like recorded conversations, and then to see the outcome and like the surveys of a person, like 1 week after, 1 month after, 1 year after, to see how much of this actually stuck with somebody. I'd be super curious to see experimentation on this in the real world. To see how it actually works.
Yeah, and so we're I've got a couple of ideas as far as experiments, and so hopefully I can get some money to do some things like this. Obviously, I'm a philosopher, so experimental philosophy is like something I know about, but I need a partner to really take this under the wing. So yeah, that's something that we'll be exploring, hopefully sooner than later. But I do want to say something about this higher ed business, all the cost of higher ed and student loans and that kind of thing. One of the things that's really frustrating about the conservative right and their sort of pitch for trade schools versus universities and that kind of thing, is that they will point to the stereotype of someone who gets out of college, $80,000 in debt with a gender studies degree, and it's such a rare occurrence.
I know.
So, for example, in I just looked today. This is the newest data that I found. 2021, I think it was, I want to say it was 8 million students graduated with a college degree. Of those 8 million students, 16,000 were getting a degree in gender studies.
Yeah.
It's so nobody goes to school for gender studies.
Or
Like it is
yeah.
always it's a challenge in these gender studies departments to keep the major afloat, not because of political pressure, although I teach in the South, so there is some political pressure, but because they just don't have enough majors to make it legitimate. Because people are going to school for STEM, and then the second tier is education, right? So those are the lion's share of degrees that are produced.
Yeah.
So this idea of the gender study blue-haired, liberal that's $80,000 in debt that can't get a job at Starbucks, it's just a rarity. Like
Yeah.
I'm sure it happens, but it just
It's also
doesn't happen.
frustrating too because like one, yeah, it's an incredibly rare degree. Two, that's an incredibly abnormal amount of student loan debt. And then three, a lot of people won't even see the very realistic like implications that the degree might have on real world stuff, even in ways that would be incredibly obvious if you were to stop ideologically loading like how evil college is. So for instance, it blew my mind when I asked Candace Owens, what did you go to college for? And she was like, journalist. And I'm like, you don't think that's helping you at all now? And she's like, how would that help me? And I'm like, what is your job? What do you mean, how would that help you? Like, you literally do documentaries, like, exploring, like, journalistic ideas. Like, you did a counter documentary to that Making of a Murder or whatever. How does journalism not help you? Or, like, people will, it's so funny. Who makes fun of gender studies degrees the hardest right now on the internet? It's red pill people, which is just gender studies, but for men, right? It's the exact same thing. So like the idea that you would sit here and shit on these degrees and then watch podcasts that are devoted to the topic of gender studies relating to men is like, it doesn't even make sense. Yeah, it's so stupid. The attack against college has nothing to do. This is, again, it's another preloaded conclusion. College is bad because it's part of the big stuff, big college, big education, woke, whatever. So then they find ways to discredit it like in any possible way they can and then go to like trade schools or something else. And there's not even like, and then all the arguments that they find to load it are just like the dumbest things in the world.
It's remarkable, and it's just it's an easy target. And I will say that there are things that cultural things that I think that especially state universities do that really sort of put them at odds with the communities they find themselves in. For example, I'm in the South. I have lots of colleagues from the Northeast or from the West Coast that just hate living in the South. And as a result, they don't go out and associate with the people that they live near. And in a state university, I think that's really important. We're at least partially funded by the public. It's important for us to actually find a home in the place where we find ourselves. So and you probably know this, but in our line of work, I'm a philosopher. I have to go where the job is. There's no I get to pick where I live. Unless you went to Harvard and have a really unique research program, you don't get to write your own check.
Yeah.
You go where you can find a job. And so lots of people that were educated. This is also a hiring problem because Inside Higher Ed released data a couple of years ago that showed that 80% of new hires of faculty in all state universities, or really all universities across the United States, were the products of just 20 schools. So basically that means that the Ivies and then a few schools out on the West Coast are populating the majority of the schools. Like, so in Nebraska, right? Nebraska's a great school, and it's great because most of the faculty come from Harvard or Toronto or Stanford. And it's because these are the hiring practices. But there's a cultural downside to this in that a lot of times these faculty don't feel comfortable in the communities that they find themselves in. And as a result, they just associate with one another. They don't get out into the community. They don't, make friends. They don't, their kids don't play with kids that are the plumbers, the plumbers' kids and that kind of thing. And as a result, there's this real kind of there's an ability to kind of demonize the university because most people from these communities just don't know anybody that works there.
Yeah.
And so that's a problem on the liberal side. But of course, right wingers are going to like right wing. So that there's only so much you can control in that respect. But
yeah, I also like that, like in going with your example too of like the gender studies degree with $100,000 in debt. That's their example for like the average college grad. But then their average example for a tradesperson is like a plumber that owns a small business earning $250,000 a year, and that's like the average trade worker. It's like, yeah, it's so dumb. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of amnesia that goes on in this, and one of the reasons that my parents' generation really pushed me and my brother and sister into college was because they saw the effect that trade school and factory work had on the body. Right, lots of their friends were broken down by the time they were 45.
Yeah.
And so they said, you want to do something better so that you can have a full and flourishing life. And this is kind of an amnesia that's akin to the amnesia that goes on with vaccine denialism. So, for example, the anti-vax community with childhood vaccinations is largely a product of people not remembering what it was like for kids to be in iron lungs or to be permanently disfigured because of polio.
Yeah.
Because we've forgotten what that's like. Now there's this idea, well, we don't need these vaccines anymore. And I think that there's a kind of amnesia about what trades actually entail. And I think it probably is going to be a cycle. There's going to be this big push for trades, and people are going to get broken down, and
it's a super romanticized field in like the dumbest way possible. Yeah, but it's because there's like normative loading now behind everything. Like trades are good because like being an electrician and a carpenter is a noble job because those are real things that people really need, and like computer programming and all these other stupid lame fucking things that are fake and services are fake, and if you're not like building something, it's not real and it's not true, and it's just like, yeah, it's just this like stupid weird one-dimensional view of the economy or the world or people's engagement with education or work or productivity. Yeah, it's just dumb.
And this is aside from the argument, of course, but everybody that's telling me that in the media, so Mike Rowe, for example, the dirty jobs guy,
yeah,
he goes around telling people how they should be involved in the trades and that kind of thing. He went to school for music. He's got a beautiful baritone voice. Like he was going to be a singer. Like, and he's telling me I need to go, to trade school, be an electrician, and like sacrifice my health. It just comes off a little rich.
All of these guys, have these backgrounds. Yeah, Candace Owens went to school for journalism, and out of state, cushy, nice, huge, I guess, debt, had to get to go there, went to school for journalism, and all these people, we look at like I always bring this up, we always look at like the corrupt rich elites, and it's like, man, like these guys are corrupt, and they're super wealthy, and they're doing everything they can to get their kids ahead. Like they must be sending their kids to the best trade schools, I guess, right? But obviously they're not. They're all going to prestigious Ivy League colleges that these people all insist don't teach you anything. But then Candace will have these like things where, again, it feels like an Occam's razor where they're like, oh, well, obviously it's all corrupt or whatever. And then it's like, okay, well, I remember when Candace Owens, when I was trying to ask her to explain, can you tell me how there's two completely separate tracks where you're saying that the Democrats are trying to control black people by keeping them poor and stupid, but don't you also say Democrats are trying to control woke kids by sending them to college? Like, these seem like completely opposite things. And remember, for cognitive dissonance, you either have to change your mind or change the facts. So then her way of changing the facts to resolve the cognitive dissonance was, oh, well, kids that go to college aren't literate. And I'm like, wait, you're telling me that kids that graduate degrees like can't read or aren't literate? She's like, yeah, that's right. And I'm like, wait, what? And then another way for her to resolve it was I was asking her, like, hold on, you're saying Democrats are trying to control like gangsters and thugs and gangbangers? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, these people probably don't vote. And I was like, oh shit, well, that's true. So that's a really dissonant thing, because how is it that they're trying to control people that end up not voting? So her response, change the facts. Well, I think thugs and gangbangers do actually vote in huge numbers. I'm like, wait, what? That's your position? It's like, it's completely incomprehensible. Or when I ask a killer question, and I can't believe she admitted to not knowing anything about this, is when I asked her, isn't one of the reasons why black women are the only demographic of women that have pulled ahead of black men the fact that they're going to college and getting degrees? And then her answer, even though she came here wanting to talk to 3 topics related to black culture, was, I don't know anything about that. You don't know anything about the separation of black women from black men, which is like one of the biggest like black issues right now in the United States? How can you not know anything about that? That's insane to me. You know more about P. Diddy's case than you do about Donald Trump's secret documents case? Or you know more about like black culture as it relates to rap music or WAP than like the difference between education between men and women in the black community? Like, yeah, oh god, that drives me crazy.
I don't understand. So I have little love for Ben Shapiro's positions. I have little love for Ben Shapiro, really, whatever, but I don't understand how the Daily Wire can have this umbrella with people like Candace and Matt Walsh is similar sort of crazy reasoning. I just don't I don't see how that works. I mean, obviously,
it worked on me. I fucked up a lot in the past, and I think I was completely wrong on this. I admit that now. I used to think that Ben Shapiro was the center of the Daily Wire. So in my mind, the Daily Wire is like a center right thing. And I argued that with my family. So my family's like, oh no, they're way for that. I'm like, no, Ben Shapiro's like pretty center right. I stand by that Ben Shapiro's center right. I didn't realize that Ben Shapiro was like far left on the Daily Wire. And then when I started looking more at like Matt Walsh and Candace Owens and is it Michael Knowles? Yeah. And I'm like, oh wait, holy shit. I didn't realize that, Ben Shapiro was the farthest left person. And I would actually say far left on the Daily Wire, and that like, I don't think he believes in the election conspiracy shit. I don't think that he thinks that Donald Trump didn't try to steal the election. He admits that he might try again, but he'll just fail. He doesn't seem to be on board with all the crazy vax conspiracy stuff. Compared to everyone else on there, he's almost like a center left fucking progressive. Yeah, it's wild how crazy the people on that platform are. Jesus Christ.
it is it's something. Let's just put it that way. And the thing about it is that I don't know what the rhetorical strategy is to deal with someone like Ben Shapiro, because I do think that there is a way that he might be a really healthy, because he doesn't I don't think he thinks that we need to just destroy institutions. He thinks they need to be reformed significantly. So he's a little more old school, like a David Brooks in that respect. He would like to see more universities hire more conservatives, right? Whereas a lot of those people in the Daily Wire say they just want to see the thing, burn. Jordan Peterson wants to, burn down the whole university system.
Well,
and
I don't actually know if they want that, but they say it because it gets them a lot of money. Because remember, a lot of these people will say shit, but yeah, how much do they actually believe it? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm inclined to think Jordan Peterson's a true believer. But you've talked to him, so I don't
He's
know.
kind of out there crazy, yeah.
Yeah, he's got and there's something that, and this better than I do, of course, being in the public eye, you really have to have a great deal of self-belief to do the job that you do. And Jordan Peterson he's got a lot of belief in himself. And that's typically there's a reason that a lot of academics are out in the public this way. And it's because a lot of them don't have this kind of conviction. They're just not certain about a whole lot of things. And so, they're just not going to be dogmatic out in the public eye because, they might change their mind significantly. And in a case like Peterson's, imagine, for example, if Peterson were to just look at the data and decide, what? I think transgenderism is real. I'm going to have to publicly change my view. The cost is too high now. He couldn't do it.
Yeah, that's one of the things I bring up a ton due to the audience capture phenomenon and the fact that if you identify as a political side, the amount of flexibility that you have, you can trap yourself there, sometimes even in an authentic way. When I say audience capture, I realized this the other day. When I say audience capture, it comes off sometimes as an intentional grift, the way that I say it. But I think that audience capture can also happen, I don't know if you say organically, but that it can actually shape your own thoughts about yourself when you identify too heavily with a certain side. It can actually preclude you from recognizing when you're wrong about something in an organic way, not in a grifty way, if that makes sense.
It's true. I mean, it's and this happens to public intellectuals all over the place, not just Jordan Peterson. It happens to Cornel West. You can just get high in your own supply. Everybody else is telling you that you're so great, and it can contour the way that you are the modesty with which you make your claims. Jordan Peterson can say a lot about the clinical data about psychology. The idea that he knows anything about climate change is crazy.
Yeah.
But he'll state things about climate change with the same conviction that he will state with clinical psychology. I've tried to adopt this practice with my students, and it's hard because it's really, students look up to you. But I try to adopt this practice when I'm speaking out of my field of expertise. I try to adopt this practice where I use this phrase that's in the New Testament of the Bible, where the Apostle Paul says, "I speak as a man," which basically means God's not saying this, I am.
Yeah.
Right? At least that's how I read it. And so I try to tell my students, when I'm saying this is my hunch, but you don't need to trust me on agriculture. What the fuck do I know about agriculture?
Can I ask you a question? Actually, I'm so curious about this. I brought this up a lot on stream. You might have heard me say this before. It feels like when you become highly educated in a certain field or you gain a certain area of expertise, there are two paths you can go. Because I got really good at StarCraft, I know a fair bit about music. I feel like once I have like a decent level of expertise in these fields, when I look at other things, one of the things I try to keep in mind, and I'm not perfect, I sure I fuck up. One of the things I try to keep in mind is like, okay, well, there's a lot to know when it comes to a particular video game. There's a lot to know when it comes to music. There's probably a lot to know when it comes to a lot of topics. So even if I feel like I know a lot in a particular area, I should at least be relatively humble or open to change because I might be incorrect here. So I try to caveat, I try to hedge. People don't care all the time, but whatever. And then you've got like the alternative mode. I would say people like Elon Musk or Jordan Peterson fit this perfectly, where when you gain an area of expertise in one thing, now you speak as though you're an expert in everything. What do you think is like the differentiating factor between one person and the other? Like who goes down one route or who goes on the other? Or why do you think people develop this idea that if they have expertise in one field, they can gain expertise in everything, or they automatically have expertise in everything?
I about this a little bit, and there is probably a multifaceted story. I think a lot of it has to do with the way that, at least historically in the West, we've regarded the doctorate, for example. Like, I know a little bit about one tiny area, like in research. Like I wrote about the philosophy of tragedy, for God's sake. I know this tiny sliver of something. However, I can put doctor on my mailbox. And my neighbors all say, "Oh, he's a doctor. He must know about something," And I do think there's just this powerful social reinforcement that that you're supposed to be an expert. You've developed this competency in this one area, so of course it maps onto others. And so it's really I see this all the time, and I see this in myself. So this is something to constantly sort of be on guard about, the kind of limitations of my own, sort of cognitive sort of liabilities, limitations. And I think that there are just a lot of people, especially those that went to really elite institutions that were really hard to get into and really took a lot of work to get through. All of this just sort of reinforces this thing that there's something really special about what they are and who they are and how they see into the world. So I don't have a great answer to that, but those are some of the forces that I think that sort of push into it.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Well. Anything else?
I think that's about it. I'm happy to chat. I think thanks so much for giving things a listen. I'll be interested to see if anything that I have offered in terms of the conspiracy theorizing sort of plays out in real time in some of your discussions. I do, because I've got this sort of interpretive framework in my mind. Every time you have a discussion with some kind of denier, I'm always sort of interested to see if I can predict how it's going to go. And so it's been fun. It's been fun to sort of watch this and see how well the sort of framework maps onto what you're doing.
Yeah. I wish that sometimes when I'm talking to people, I wish I could just get people to take a slightly different view of how they construct narratives in the world. That it feels like people have I don't know if it would even make sense to say this, like that people think they can have deductive views of events that have happened rather than like inductive reasoning, to where like you're collecting a set of facts and you're probabilistically building towards a certain conclusion of what like most likely follows a set of facts, rather than thinking that they can say with absolute certainty, like almost from these premises, like axiomatically this conclusion will always follow about this grand narrative. And it's like unchallengeable, unchangeable. The just so story descriptions of everything in the world. I feel like if people just change the way they viewed things, that would change, but maybe not. I don't know. One thing I don't know if you, or go ahead, sorry. Nope.
One thing that I thought was really, that I think is such an effective strategy, and it's actually sort of the direction that epistemology is going, that you've used in previous interactions, is the idea of asking people to make wagers on things.
Oh fuck yeah, that's what I was just about to bring up when I said yeah. Keep going. Yeah.
I really wish that you'd ask Candace, you'd bet her $1,000 that this Diddy lawsuit goes nowhere. To test her. To test her confidence in this whole thing, because she's really speaking authoritatively. Now she'll hedge a little bit. No, we don't know for sure, but she's speaking with some authority. I really would like to see how, whether she'd take the bet.
True. Yeah, I should do more research on some of those things and then ask if people would want to wager money on it. And truly, what it should be, because either as part of the betting process, although this comes down to their like mathematical understanding, like if they want to bet too and they want to accept the bet, that I need big odds on that bet, or they need to adjust their conviction, because if somebody's talking with like 90% conviction, they should be willing to wager me 9-1 on my money. So I'll bet $1,000. If I'm right, you pay me $9,000. If I'm wrong, I'll give you $1,000. Or because if they're going to say I'm absolutely sure this can happen, well, this must be a bad bet for me. But if they want to make it 1-1, I think that it mathematically means that their conviction isn't there, and verbally they should scale their convictions as well. Yeah. I need to start bringing that back more, because I think it's the easiest, most like raw way to demonstrate that somebody's full of shit with a level of conviction they're expressing about a particular thing.
It's an excellent strategy, and as I say, in the epistemological literature, all this business about truth being justified true belief has really fallen away toward a more probabilistic sort of wagering kind of understanding what we mean when we say something is true. And so like it's really in step right now with what's in vogue in epistemology.
True, although I think we should be careful that I think we as people, humans, or whatever, tend to be very recent with our analysis of everything, and I think we have an incorrect view sometimes of the past, and that like people will say, oh, people were hyperlogical in the past, people made more sense, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the human brain is probably about the same as it was probably 50 to 100,000 years ago, definitely 10,000 years ago. I don't think our brains have changed fundamentally, but the environments that we're in have changed a lot. So I think we need to attribute a lot of the changing of how we understand the world with like changes in the environment, and then work that way, rather than assuming that people are on some baser level more irrational or less rational today than they were, in the 40s and 50s and 60s or something.
I definitely agree. I don't think that much about the human condition, the human cognitive condition anyway, has significantly altered. I think we're more similar than we are different. Mm-hmm. We get better ways to talk about it, I guess. But But anyway, that's what I have for you, and it was a pleasure to talk to you. And if you ever have other ideas or questions, you know where to find me.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, and then same to you. If there's ever, yeah, shoot me a DM if you want to chat about anything, or if you have an idea, if I've got like a conversation coming up and you're like, oh, you should try this or think about this, or this person says, yeah, feel free to shoot me a DM on that. Yeah.
Will do. Sounds great.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye.